Now our next topic is going to be muscular fatigue as well as cramping or muscular cramping. And I couldn't talk about these topics without showing you some race footage from one of the most iconic finishes from an Ironman. And this footage has been referred to or known since as the crawl. And it highlights the very end of one of these races. And if you've never heard of an Ironman before, people swim in the ocean, roughly I think it's 2-ish miles, and then they bike 120 miles, and then they cap it off by running a marathon. So it's a massive endurance event. So take a look at this video footage and we'll talk about what's going on in this situation.
Shawn Welch is in a desperate spot. Her body has run out of fuel. No calories to burn. Systems shutting down. The legs are there, you just can't feel them. The eyes still see, but through a gauzy veil of delirium. At this point, Shawn Welch is aware of two things. The finish line is so close, and someone is so close behind. After more than 140 miles, it's come down to less than 100 feet to that damn line. Just yards behind, her stalker appears. It's Wendy Ingram. Their bodies were obliterated, but the spirit held firm. Welch and Ingram crawling in the dramatic spirit of Julie Moss. In a battle for fourth place.
This is certainly one of the more dramatic finishes to an endurance event, and luckily they both got counted in the finish as they were counted as crossing the line on their own volition. I have seen events for endurance events specifically where someone is really struggling right at the end and family or friends run up to them and help them across the line, and then they get disqualified right at the very end. So that's always really painful to see. Luckily, both of these women were counted. But what you see here is the point to where a muscle is so fatigued, so starved for some sort of nutrient to provide ATP that they literally have just lost function of their muscular system and really struggled to get across the line at that point. So let's delve a little bit more deeply into muscle fatigue as well as muscle cramps. Muscle fatigue is often defined as a decrease in the force of muscular contraction, but we should be really careful here to define it maybe two ways. One would be a decrease in the force of the contraction, but number two would also be a decrease in the shortening velocity time or shortening speed of a given muscle. Because if a muscle isn't as responsive, right, that's also an indication that it's fatiguing. Now, when we do high intensity short bursts of exercise, There are multiple things that can contribute to a decrease in force production. Most notably would be the byproducts that are produced by the muscle, things like lactate and hydrogen ions, and even some of those free-floating phosphates that are in the muscle. The problem with all these free-floating molecules is they interfere with the ability of actin and myosin to interact with each other in a negative way, which can impact total force of the contraction as well as the speed of the contraction. Now, when we're talking about long duration exercise, so when we say this, we mean something 2 or 4 hours or maybe even longer than that. Well, in this case, the factors can be a little different. Not only do those buildup of those individual molecules play a role, things like the hydrogen ions, the lactate, the phosphate, as well as just free radicals within the muscle, but now you have to contend with electrolyte imbalances potentially within the muscle if you're having heavy sweating happening, or maybe glycogen depletion where you don't have enough energy to do the work that you're trying to do any longer. So muscular fatigue, it's not a super simple definition, and it's also not always an easy correction. It really depends on what's contributing to the muscular fatigue. Now, when I ask a large class, who has ever had a muscle cramp? Almost the entire class will raise their hand. So it's something many people have experienced. Sometimes you get it really bad in the calf and you refer to it as a Charlie horse. And throughout your lifetime, you've been probably told, oh, you need to drink some Gatorade, something that was developed for the Florida Gators back in the 70s. Or maybe you should drink some pickle juice. And we tell people to do that because it contains electrolytes. And for a long time, we've thought that that was the primary mechanism causing muscular cramps. And it made sense, right? Especially for exercise in very hot and humid environments where you're expelling a lot of sweat, which is going to contain both salt and potassium. Now, the issue here is, for many of you, you've probably said, yeah, I've had a muscle cramp and taking those electrolytes has not helped me. And what we're finding is a lot of muscular cramps aren't just due to electrolyte imbalances, and actually might be due to just excessive firing of the neuron that innervates that muscle fiber. So now you can't correct that with electrolytes, and instead you've got to address the communication of the neuron to the muscle in order to get that muscular cramp to stop. So what we actually see after really rigorous, extensive, long duration activity is an increase in the excitatory activity of the muscle spindles and then a reduction in those inhibitory effects of the Golgi tendon organs. So you have to think backwards to what are these things actually doing. If I excite the muscle spindles, right, they're sensitive to length and they're going to cause contraction of my agonist muscle. And if I inhibit my Golgi tendon organs, well, normally they're going to cause relaxation of my agonist muscle. So in this case, it's going to prevent the relaxation that would have been stimulated, and instead it's going to accentuate the excitatory activity of that agonist, which leads to that really hard, painful cramp that you experience. Very often for this type of muscle cramping, you can get a lot of relief just with some passive stretching and some massaging of that muscle. But cramps can certainly be really frustrating. I know there are individuals who it doesn't seem that any sort of massaging really helps, and even using the electrolytes doesn't help. They still seem to have some issue with kind of chronic muscle cramps. But for the most part, they fall in these two categories of some sort of electrolyte disturbance, or more prevalently, the excessive firing of the motor neurons. Now, some of you are probably thinking, wait a second, I've only ever been told by coaches and trainers, etc., to go drink some Gatorade or drink some pickle juice whenever I'm having a muscle cramp, right? Directly trying to attack the fact that it could be related to electrolytes. But if our cramping is maybe due to the firing of our neurons or the overfiring of our neurons, how do we correct for that? And what's really neat is there was a Nobel laureate who studied potassium channels, and he was also an avid kayaker. And his name is Dr. Rod McKinnon, and he noticed when he was out with his friend kayaking and this was sea kayaking, so it's really strenuous, that he would get these terrible muscle cramps in his upper arms and in his shoulders and in his back, and his friend never seemed to get them. And he did all the things that you're supposed to do with trying to take in electrolytes to correct this problem, and he was still having an issue. So being a true scientist, he went into his kitchen and thought, okay, it's not the electrolytes, it's got to be something different. And so he started making all these concoctions from his house to try and figure out a way to prevent these muscle cramps from occurring. And what he needed was a really strong inhibitory stimulus to go to the spinal cord and stop those motor neurons from doing their excessive firing. And actually what he found was that certain spices, if they were consumed, could activate specific ion channels in both the mouth and throat that would send inhibitory signals to the spinal cord. So basically it could override that overactivity of the alpha motor neurons that were causing the cramping. And so he developed a company out of this, which is called Hotshot. And just like you can take a GU or a 5-hour energy, you can also take a Hotshot, and they have a proprietary formula that does incorporate some electrolytes, but also specifically incorporates specific spices that activate these ion channels in the mouth and the throat in order to calm down these overexcited neurons that can lead then to muscle cramps. So pretty neat. You can check out that website. They sponsor a lot of endurance athletes and other sports that tend to see a lot of cramping, but it's a neat way where a scientist just noticed this problem in his own life and thought, well, I'm just going to fix this. And he delved right into it and built a whole business then around it.